Hey, so remember when we said this would only be one more episode long? Well, it's gonna be two more long, because sometimes it makes more sense to cut these in half and make them more watchable. And also, they get uploaded quicker that way, so good news all around, I think. What, more Eternals? I thought we were done. Sort of. I ended up pushing this whole thing out to 3 extended episodes so I could just do the here's some of where this might be going and why part, because the nature of this particular project, or at least the nature of the stuff it's based off, and my read of it, which could well be completely off, but as I'm never going to tire of pointing out, I've been pretty solid on this overall, applies less to where its material can go, because it's already been really broad and we don't really know what they're going to do with it in the films, and more to what does this demonstrate about how Marvel is picking these projects in the first place, and how that informs their development after, which is more interesting and overlooked discussion I've been looking to explore in this context for a while. See, while I'm not exaggerating when I say that episodes like this are kind of a pain in the ass as an undertaking, and it's a lot more writing and editing work compared to what brings in view counts on YouTube these days,
You got paid?
what it does do on the positive side is give me an opportunity to revisit and recollect my thoughts in a more organized manner that helps clarify other things and inspire in other directions. For example, as concerns the Eternals, for the longest time the most perplexing part about this whole enterprise for me wasn't any of the cosmic stuff, but why Marvel was bothering to drag a mid-tier character like the Black Knight into it, or invest an in-demand actor like Kit Harington for what I have to assume is a multi-film commitment. The character is a minor cult favorite at best, he was never a big merchandise driver, and the thing that connects him to the Eternals is being part of a 90s Avengers team with Cersei, which is not exactly remembered as the best period for anyone involved. Writers, characters, the brand, etc. So what is the big deal? But going back over all of that stuff with fresh eyes in relation to the general sweep of present-day Marvel Studios decision-making, it actually makes some sense to me now. In fact, it makes a lot of sense, if I'm being honest. I mean, you can certainly joke around, and I did, about Black Knight being any of a dozen other superhero guys with a medieval gimmick skinned over their regular act, but on the other hand, urban fantasy as a thing has been kind of having a moment, particularly in fantasy lit with the adult audience that grew up on the wizard school and teen vampire things, so yeah, Jon Snow playing a present-day guy. They've said he might be a history professor in the movie. In the comics, he was a physicist originally, I think, who finds out his ancestors were knights, but like evil knights, and he gets a magic sword, but it's evil, so he can't use it too often, and he fights crime dressed like an actual knight. That's very Marvel Studios, looks at analytics for demographics they'd like to do better with, and says, do we have anything in the stable that feels a little bit like Highlander, a little bit like Kate and Leopold, but with some Witcher in there too? Answer to a question they hadn't asked yet.
You've met your match, you foul, bellowing beast!
Oh, and his love interest is basically a super evolved alien demigoddess archangel who outclasses him by like 1 billion levels, but they've got that super into each other type A power couple thing happening, so it works out. Yeah, okay, yeah, that's some character stuff you can easily build compelling features off right there, and it's something the MCU doesn't really have an existing version of. I can easily see Marvel Studios' retooled version of the Black Knight becoming a very popular mainstream superhero character right now today. And I totally see multiple scenarios where this development made complete, even mandatory sense, even if it's something only set up as a maybe in the Eternals movie itself, which, who knows, there's probably a lot going on in there. But to reiterate for the billionth time, I honestly don't think there's a magic secret, silver bullet, one weird trick, or even serendipity of cultural circumstance that explains how Marvel became the biggest pop culture brand or the most successful part of the Disney machine right now specifically. They're a well-run studio headed by a seemingly pretty decent dude who's really good at his job and hires other people who are good at their jobs. They have a clear idea of what they're trying to produce, which is mass market entertainment, the quality of which they seem to genuinely care about. It's not hard to figure out, it's just hard to actually practice in an industry generally driven by ego and excess. So far, it's working, but if there is anything resembling a stroke of luck involved, it's that the way Marvel approaches its development of actual films, TV shows, concepts in general happens to align perfectly with the interests of Disney as a parent company in a way they wouldn't had they been bought up by some other similar Hollywood entity. And luck probably isn't even the right word, since it's entirely likely that this is the reason Disney bought them in the first place, and the luck part was that Kevin Feige and other architects of the MCU were already in the process of doing the best version of maximizing that potential on their own. A common criticism of the Marvel Studios aesthetic, or general tone if you like, is that it's entirely too dependent on character to audience engagement and character interplay versus narrative momentum, aka plot, in order to drive the storytelling. That's increasingly obvious from the first Avengers onward, that even the characters in universe are more or less aware that the specific details of each adventure are interchangeable contrivances and MacGuffin hunts that don't really matter distinctly, because it's really an excuse for the audience to spend time with the characters, watch them spend time with each other, interact in various ways, and enjoy the action, suspense, drama, etc. vicariously. Of course, it makes a certain amount of sense that any criticism, positive and negative, of Marvel's storytelling would be character-centric, since literally all of their projects start from turning Marvel Comics characters into movie properties, not necessarily adaptations of Marvel Comics storyline. And without question, the less good of the Marvel films, your Iron Man 2s, your Thor the Dark Worlds, Age of Ultrons, etc., tend to be the ones where they're clearly hitting obligatory story beats, while the actors fill up the empty spots with charisma. On the other hand, character first is not exactly a bad priority to have if you're doing narrative fiction, which they are. If people can't invest in, relate, or at least find interesting at least a few of the characters in a story, they're not going to give a damn what your point is, how complex the narrative is, or how much world building you do. Just ask Warner Brothers. Well, you still can. There's like 4 versions of Justice League now, and they're all still terrible. Look, no, I'm sorry, those versions are all bad and you can't give a shit about any of them at all. As once and future Marvel director James Gunn put it recently on Twitter, you can have a bad story with good characters, you can't have a good story with bad characters. And the extremely fortunate and also, to be certain, extremely rare confluence of creatively positive and business positive interests that intersect here is that a project and or franchise development model that places building strong characters as top priority works out ideally for what the parent company wanted in raw numbers, what's this worth to us sense. Here's what I'm talking about. Disney does not make most of its direct tangible hard assets money off the film, TV, animation media it produces. If they did, they'd have gone out of business decades ago during one of several low periods they've had. Disney makes money because they own a ton of prime real estate all over the world on which they operate massively profitable theme parks, hotels, and vacation resorts. That's where their money is. The media productions have been, up until recently when they acquired enough TV networks, satellite web, and streaming services for that to be a profit driver too, an indirect profit driver because those productions create intellectual property in the form of iconography that those parks and resorts can then be themed around and made enticing and worthwhile to the visitors. To use the most over-the-top metaphor possible, Disney is constantly building temples and they need a constant new supply of gods to put in them for people to make offerings to. So when Marvel says, yes, Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings is another MCU movie about a cool guy with a destiny he's unsure about fulfilling and complicated father issues connected to both a slick modern action movie world and a more fantastical action movie world with intriguing allies and enemies just dying to reveal their secrets, you might be thinking, well, obviously the difference will be the details in the execution. The mouse, on the other hand, is only thinking, another 4 to 6 new exciting characters? Terrific. We have multiple parades, multiple times a day, in multiple places all over the world that need fresh people in them all the time. How many Eternals are there? 10? Holy shit. That can be its own live show. Run that number now.
Money, money.
Anyway, you get the idea. That's kind of a long intro to the main point here, because the same actual very good advice for writing movies edict Marvel filmmakers and producers overwhelmingly lean on happens to also be what's best for business. Literally, if you're trying to guesstimate where any of this stuff is going, it's never a good bet to expect that they're going to stray from this general formula, at least in terms of priorities. Characters first, in terms of why you make a movie, what the focus is, where the drama and conflict will be, what the other characters or story elements might appear and why. Plot secondary, and MCU continuity bullshit distantly third, because the only real trick in this whole thing is that for all the hype it gets, the Marvel Cinematic Universe continuity connections are mostly created retroactively and worked out to make sense on rewatch rather than planned ahead of time outside of sequels via clever plot points and MacGuffins that seem specific and important but are actually malleable and even easily ignored if it turns out you don't want to use them at all.
Fake.
So, based on that, knowing what I know, and thus spent the previous 2 videos helping you know about the Eternals, other than now I understand what Kit Harington is doing here, maybe what else might be potentially on the table based on the fact that this is coming in this form based on that formulation? Well, to start with, you have to disregard any notion that they made the Eternals so they could justify or explain the inclusion of some other story point somewhere else. That's not how they make these. That's a terrible way to manage storytelling. That's why the movies are generally good. They didn't know where or what all the Infinity Stones were when they started doing that whole angle. They didn't decide what Thanos' master plan or characterization was until they were writing the script for Infinity War, so while there seems to be a general idea of where this whole next stretch of movies are heading in terms of where they'd like to end up in general themes, not so much a plan of point A is needed for points B through C, D, etc. But we also know that Marvel creators talk to each other, that Kevin Feige and the other producers talk to everyone, and that there's a here's who available for what coordination between films and now Disney Plus series, so knowing what is and isn't in play can and has affected the idea process at times, and while never a requirement, certain creators are fans of the specific material they're working on, like Taika Waititi currently borrowing elements of Jason Aaron's Thor run, or of Marvel and the MCU in general, like Chloe Zhao, who, remember, picked making the Eternals movie to Marvel Studios rather than pitching herself to direct a film that had already been greenlit.
Being a superhero is hard, otherwise everyone would do it. But it's real, and it's different.
Sounds like a bummer.
Thank you.
So in my version, she's gay. Okay, bye!
So just as with their incarnations in the comics, who even knows if Marvel's plans on the Eternals being a franchise or a standalone film introducing a general concept, but now they're here and they bring with them a bunch of big deal celestial hand-wavium mythology that future productions might find or have already found useful for getting their own material across. And since we do already know what's in the pipeline for the next couple years after the Eternals movie, we can finish up trying to extrapolate what kind of effects it may open up or have already opened up for these other projects in the future. Starting with the more general stuff right here, and then in the God willing final installment of this next time, more specific, extremely hypothetical stuff I feel like might come up not just because it existed in a comic at some point, but rather based on how they've repurposed this kind of material previously thus far. So, here's that. Okay, so the number one thing the Eternal stuff got used for, other than telling Eternal stories in comics, is filling in backstory for all the other Marvel stuff. We spent 2 episodes going over this. Look back to those. The MCU doesn't really have much of a too many different old-timey mythologies problem yet, but it's getting there, and finding a way to personalize and or characterize those kind of big sweeping ideas is a good way to keep them manageable. Apparently, for example, Namor, the Submariner, and Atlantis are expected to be part of the storyline, if not the official antagonists of Black Panther Wakanda Forever, and the sinking of Atlantis is both a general go-to ancient aliens trope and pretty much always part of the Eternal Celestials business in comics, so I feel like we'll probably at least see a reference to that in the Eternals movie and then get called back to later. Moreover, speaking of Wakanda Forever, I don't know that anything as extreme as the whole giant dead Celestials bled to death on primordial Earth, and that's why so many superheroes are from their thing is imminent for the MCU itself, but I do know that where did that mountain-sized vibranium meteor that we built our country around come from in the first place has been a plot point in more recent Black Panther comics, and tying that into the Eternals or Celestial stuff just falling out of the sky at various points in time would be a pretty clean compression, trying any number of why is this place special questions you don't want to waste time on otherwise. After all, one of the other MCU storytelling masterstrokes is compressing the good parts of long, convoluted character arcs or storylines into manageable single-film arcs, like how Captain Marvel manages to squeeze the original Marvel, Kree soldier who defects to Earth origin, Carol Danvers was near an explosion Miss Marvel origin, her brainwashed by a creeper misogynist storyline, and her getting off that shit and eventually leveling up to Captain Marvel multiple decade arc into a single movie. And speaking of Captain Marvel business, there's still something of an open question as to what the status of all the interrelated Kree, Skrull, and Humans business is, given that these Skrulls, at least the one we've encountered, turned out to be unambiguous good guys in one of Captain Marvel's main narrative twists, while the Inhumans and Kree connectivity all already played out as part of the underperforming Inhumans miniseries and the now concluded Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., both of which we still don't really know 100% the status of in terms of being considered full MCU canon at this time, and while that doesn't matter in terms of technical storytelling, it is of interest in terms of what the jumping on and off point is going to be for the traditionally Inhuman-related Miss Marvel series and the Skrull-based Samuel L. Jackson Nick Fury star vehicle Secret Invasion, both of which are coming up pretty soon. So if nothing else, the commonly cited comics detail that the Celestials mucked around with the Kree and the Skrulls in their civilization origins could be put to work laying foundations needed for those characters in those properties. Okay, now this is a little bit tricksy because technically the 3 MCU projects generally known or strongly presumed to have a multiverse narrative happening are all coming out before Eternals does. Spider-Man No Way Home, Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, and Loki, which is currently in the middle of its Disney Plus run, but because of pandemic delays and schedule changes, that wasn't always meant to be the case, so we don't necessarily know if we'll end up seeing or hearing things that were originally meant to exist in the context of understanding that there was some much bigger new context to how the universe worked already.
Everybody got that?
That having been said, Loki has already established the way the multiverse works, if it technically exists at all, and if so in what form, since the MCU kind of plays fast and loose with the differences between what constitutes an alternate universe, alternate timeline, or alternate dimension, are all related to the creation of the current, whatever you want to call it, of the MCU itself, and the Celestials are almost always tied in to some version of the birth of the universe and or time itself, whichever in the beginning Marvel has currently decided is the actual beginning. In at least one telling, they may have inadvertently created the multiverse by destroying an ancient being comprising an original base universe called the First Firmament, so if we're about to start yanking on those threads, they'll probably be involved somewhere.
The war of man against machine raged on through the early 70s. You don't remember because back then it was only a prophecy.
Yeah,
but now in the future, the past has occurred.
Just hang on a second, okay?
Sure.
But for now, you remember the Celestial Madonna saga from last episode? Well, something I breezed past a bit was that its main bad guy, as the story comes to an end, was Kang the Conqueror, pretty much the main Avengers enemy from the pre-Marvel Cinematic Universe era of that franchise. He's an evil future guy, uses time travel to make sure his future comes true. Revisit this episode for more details. Anyway, the Celestial Madonna storyline popularized a tradition of Kang teaming up or battling with versions of himself from different points in history that had evolved into different personas. In this case, the imposter ancient Egyptian pharaoh Rama-Tut, will come back to him, and Immortus, the Kang from even further into the future, whose creepy clone son is later responsible for the mind control rape of Carol Danvers.
What is a sex crime?
Yeah, that thing. Oh, and Kang's sometime one true love, sometimes greatest enemy, Ravonna Renslayer, is a main character on Loki, so show about alternate timeline, mysterious figures who manage the continuity of history, characters specifically connected to Kang. Suffice to say, I've got some hypotheses of how Loki fits into this whole thing and has to do with at least one story with the word celestial in it. But more immediately, Loki and the next incoming MCU series, What If, are both working with the core concept of a multiverse period, and that means both are, like WandaVision before them, leading either directly or indirectly toward Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, almost certainly also Spider-Man No Way Home, and this is where things get even stranger. Because believe it or not, now we have to talk about these. Yeah, really, crazy as it sounds, this is potentially where the Sony bootleg halfway there Spider-Man universe may actually become somewhat relevant. How is that remotely possible? Find out next episode. I'm Bob, and that's very nearly the big picture. I promise.